Okay.
Hello, everyone. So, most of our bloopers are wonderfully amusing. This one is not, it's not hilarious, but it illustrates how when amateurs and non-professionals do translations, they don't quite turn out as the way they should, the way they're intended. So a sign in France said in French, for the respect of everyone, please leave the toilet in the state in which you would wish it to be found upon entering. And the sign in English said very similarly, but not quite the same, for the respect of all, thank you to leave the toilets in the state where you would find the entrance. So not exactly what it was supposed to mean, but that's an example of what happens when we don't do processes correctly. So today's guest is very special. She is Marion Renk-Rosenthal, and she's a California-based American and German multilingual and cultural TV producer and project manager who has lived in the UK, in France, in Germany, and in Luxembourg. She speaks fluent French and German and excellent Spanish and works in media, PR, and tourism. Her projects range from producing European documentary films to managing international VIP business travel programs in the US. In all of her projects, Marion bridges linguistic and cultural gaps between global clients and their audience or participants. Welcome, Marion. Delighted that you're with us today.
Hi, Philip. Thank you so very much for having me.
So perhaps we could start by your telling us some of your most successful or interesting documentaries that you've made over the years.
Yes, I had to think about that because obviously I've been at it since 1986, since I've come to the United States, and shortly after European media were privatizing. So I got a lot of work immediately. I've made over 50 films and countless reportages. And I was thinking about the ones that have an impact that I remember. The one that was really outstanding was about killer whale Corky, an orca. She was captured in British Columbia, and she's part of SeaWorld's attraction in San Diego. It was a film that won a commendation by the Genesis Awards, the American Humane Society's annual awards for nature and animal protection. And we're very proud of that because it had an impact long before Blackfish. It raised awareness about the problems of orca captivity. And it was a beautiful story to tell. And we got to travel to meet a biologist in British Columbia, Paul Spong, who has Orca Lab on Hansen Island, and who to this day advocates for releases and freedom and anti-captivity. And it has an impact on the industry, on display industries, of course. Another one I really remember fondly was the most adventuresome production we tracked through the Mosquitia jungle in Honduras. And we were the first people in there in many, many years looking for the legendary lost white city. And back in the mid-90s, we did not find it. We had a very adventuresome trip and a lot of great footage, and it was an interesting film. However, we couldn't find the lost white city. We may have walked right over it because it was just incredibly green and muddy everywhere. It was a real physically challenging job for us. Meanwhile, my then director of photography, Steve Elkins, he became obsessed with that legend, and he in college had studied anthropology, and he is fascinated with the historical aspects. So he started researching like crazy, and by 2012 he had determined what area would be most likely the site. And he had gone to the Smithsonian and interviewed multiple scientists and anthropologists and researchers in different universities. And meanwhile, LiDAR technology had evolved, and he organized financing, worked with the University of Houston, Texas, and the Honduran government, and they located the structures completely overgrown by jungle, Meanwhile, that site has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So that documentary we did originally, he came with the idea because he knew some adventures, some types in Honduras. I proposed it to a German client who I knew would be probably interested. German universities have a lot of involvement in Honduran research and historic and assisting Honduran scientists. So there was an interest in the German public already about the country, although nobody knows how to pronounce the capital, and I had to learn it. It's Tegucigalpa. And the first time you see it, you're like, what? Where? So the German client had an interest in that film, and it became successful, and it launched Steve's huge venture. Steve, meanwhile, is president of the Explorers Club in Southern California, and the project has had worldwide success and media attention. So, and it was all launched by that one documentary of us schlepping through the jungle.
That's marvelous. Perhaps you could tell for our listeners and our viewers what the White City is, because many people may not know.
Yes, the Lost White City was a legendary archaeological site that had been reported by multiple sources over the centuries as something they had seemingly seen or spotted when the Mosquitia had different climate changes. And it is probably a culture predating Maya and Olmec. It's in a very, very remote area of Honduras, of the jungle, nowadays protected by the government and international entities. It's well, right now there's too much turmoil in Honduras to visit, but generally speaking, they're trying to develop it as a ecotourism and historical tourism site. And they're trying to excavate a little, but there's of course the problem that you can see the structures, large building structures that are completely overgrown by vegetation on the LiDAR images. Douglas Preston wrote a book about it, City of the Monkey Gods. And there's a lot of legends around this city. And the problem is, though, if you excavate everything, you destroy the jungle. So what takes precedent here? And at this point, Honduras has had a lot of problems in recent years, politically and economically. So it's with very high crime rates. So I don't know how many entities can possibly work there at this point, but right now it's not exactly recommended for tourism.
Right. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Since you've worked in, lived and worked in the UK, France, and Germany, perhaps you could tell us some expectations of doing business in each of those cultures and how they are similar and how perhaps they're different.
Well, similar always is everybody wants to arrive at a positive result, as a positive outcome, whether it's a film that, they want everything to go well and for the production to work out as planned and for the film to be successful then with viewers and audience numbers. And in the tourism and business travel and business and incentive travel industry, the expectation, of course, is that guests have a wonderful experience and everything goes smoothly. What happens behind the scenes is the communication and the understanding of different cultures and different perceptions and different understanding of situations. There is no such thing as one reality. Reality is always your personal perception for you, and that's depending on your cultural background changes completely. And even if you speak a language fluently, if you've learned it in a foreign country, you do not have the same connotations and possibly background information you need to understand what is going on for each participant in your international setup. And that can take very different forms. For instance, with the social norms are very different. For instance, in the UK, it's expected and accepted to have quite a few drinks after work, and it's part of the business culture, and that has completely changed in other countries. When you look at the television series Mad Men, back in the 60s, all of the advertising industry in New York was drinking martinis at lunchtime. No longer the case. Here, it's not, it's frowned upon. In the US, it's frowned upon. You don't get smashed at work, bottom line. In Germany, you may have a beer, but the beers at lunchtime are also more or less a thing of the past, whereas in England, it's completely acceptable. In France, you may have a little glass of wine, but if you're ordering 3 martinis at lunch while your French counterpart is having maybe sipping a little bit of a rosé, again, they will have a certain opinion of you. So you need to know the social mores and the boundaries and what's acceptable and not acceptable, whether to shake hands or not to shake hands. French clients, even if you've only known them for a short time, if you're comfortable, will get very familiar with you and give you les bises, kisses on the cheeks. And actually, it's not real kisses. Americans then do the lipstick imprint on your cheek. In French, it's more the air kiss. Side, side. Depending on the area of France, it can be 2, 3, or even 4 B's. So you got to know those differences to not end up with your face in front and everybody else is going, ooh. Obviously, since the pandemic, there's more distance. In Germany, you got to sometimes manage the Germans are very attached to their own way of doing things and very much comparing. It's like, well, we do it this way. Why is it different in another country? So you have that
Sounds like
challenge.
Americans.
Yeah. So not to be offensive, but on the other hand to say, well, I really much appreciate how you do that in Germany. However, here, I know we're more familiar. It would work better if we do it that way. And so there's, negotiation at all levels at all times between the lines.
That's fascinating. Americans are known, well, the United States is known as a very informal business culture. We can pick up the phone and talk to, you're in Southern California, you can talk to someone in Maine and instantly do business, even though you've never met the person and you have no introduction. And we also do first naming all the time. And in Europe, of course, that's quite different. Could you explain some of those differences in that way?
Yes, it's in Europe, the structure in society and also at work is still very vertical. So you have the boss and then a couple of people under him or her, and then, the different departments, heads of departments that have, again, staff under them. And depending, it's a lot more vertical. So you just don't go to the boss. First of all, linguistically, in French and German, we have 2 forms of addressing somebody. The polite form, vous and sie, and the familiar form, tu and du. And again, there you have to really be comfortable with somebody before you go to informal, and you do not address your superiors in the familiar form unless you've been invited to do so. Depending a bit on industry, the boundaries differ. If you're in a creative field, people become very easygoing pretty quickly, but in corporate Germany and corporate France, that's not the case at all. And so you go, it's Mr. and Mrs. or Ms. and it's polite form, and you don't just burst in with an idea or a project. You have to warm up the contact and work through the different levels of hierarchy, and you may never see the boss.
And what about in the UK?
In the UK, it's a bit more Anglophile and more relaxed. However, it seems relaxed, but it doesn't mean that you're socially accepted into the royal circles. And it's become very clear if you watch all the drama in the media right now about how formal certain levels of society still are and how entrenched in a way of thinking of commonwealth, the older generation. So there's a big generational gap. You have that to a lesser degree also with younger Germans and French are more less formal than the older generation. In the UK, a lot of people still have a big attachment to those very formal ways. So even though they seem easygoing and only have you as a pronoun, you still have to be really careful how familiar you get. It's actually more of a guessing game than in France or Germany.
I've always advised people when they go to Europe, it's always best to assume formality and address this person as in the UK, Mr. and Ms. or Mrs., whatever. And of course, in Germany, mein Herr, Frau, Monsieur, Madame, Senor, Senora, whatever. Always start with the formal until you're invited to be informal. Is that a good rule?
That is perfect, yes. And I would encourage global companies to work with a company like yours, to work with you, because you have local staff everywhere. And even if somebody speaks the language fluently, localization of web content, of advertising content, of marketing content differs from region to region. Even between the different various German-speaking countries, Austrians, Swiss, and Germans aren't necessarily alike. Even within Germany, I'm from the north, Hamburg. Munich is a totally different ballgame. Bavarians have their own mindset and culture. So work with a company like yours to have local experts who know how to address that specific market.
Yeah, thank you very much. I did not pay you to say that, by the way.
No, you didn't. But I encourage people to do that because I see really weird translated web content and I'm like, ooh, not good. That's where, you can't just go Google Translate and hope for the best.
Exactly.
It looks tacky.
Yeah, actually, we did a very interesting project as an aside for a German, it's a kind of a CPA firm based in Germany with an office in the US. And they translated their website into English for the US market, but it was it was formal, it was stiff, a lot of run-on sentences. It was simply not the way that Americans would speak, and with no benefits and appeals to the American market. So just because it can be translated doesn't mean that it's acculturated.
Exactly.
You've also lived in Luxembourg, and that's very unusual because Europeans, of course, live in Luxembourg, but most Americans don't or haven't. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about Luxembourg and the culture there, as well as the business expectations, if there are any differences as well.
Yes, it's a really small country and pretty much right in the middle, bordering on Belgium, Netherlands, Germany and France, and part of Benelux. However, they have and there's only around 300 families that are real Luxembourgers. And there's the workforce they need. It's a huge banking center for Europe, has been for a long time. It was also the first country in Europe that had privatized media. That's how I got there. I got a job with RTL, Radio Television Luxembourg. So out of that small country with its own laws, they were allowed to broad private channel content long before other countries privatized their media. And so it was sort of the rock and roll pirate station days before the other countries privatized. And when you deal with Luxembourg, I was there for 2 years. My aunt and uncle had worked for the European Parliament. They had spent their whole life there pretty much. And I have cousins who are born and raised in Luxembourg. So that helped me a lot adapt and learn about the culture and meet Luxembourgers, because Luxembourgers feel a little threatened by the fact that they're such a small country surrounded by much bigger ones. They're multicultural and multilingual automatically. The own language is a dialect that's a bit of a mix between French and German called Letzeburgisch. And it's now also in written form more often than it used to be, but it's mostly used verbally. And the business languages are French and German, and they all speak it fluently. It's taught in all schools and everybody, and they don't dub television program for Luxembourg. So like the Dutch people, the kids grow up listening to everything in its original format. So a lot of Luxembourgers speak many languages. And it has its own culinary specialties, its own wine region, its own cigarette brand, its own beer brand, its own brewery, actually several breweries in that small country. And you have to be very aware of the fact that it's its own culture and linguistic area to not be offensive to Luxembourgers. It's not like, oh, yeah, so you're like the French. It's like, no, you're not. And you're not like the Germans either. They're Luxembourgers. And they have, it's a beautiful country. It's a duchy. So they have a duke who's still a very big presence in political circles and diplomatic circles. And it's a interesting mix of, and it's a crossroads. A lot of trains and roads cross between different countries at this point. From my local friends, I understand they're perturbed by that because it's become a hub for criminal activity in drug dealing, human trafficking, etc. So there's a lot of international intelligence services involved at this point.
Fascinating. Are there any specific business do's or don'ts when dealing with Luxembourg?
Try to learn a few words of Luxembourgish to be able to greet people in their own language. Because if you walk into a meeting and you immediately just rattle off in English, French, or German without making any effort, that is considered rude. I would say if you want to develop a warmer relationship, ask questions, be interested in Luxembourg, learn about Luxembourg, and learn at least a few phrases of Luxembourgish and I always do a deep dive for every project before I get into it. With Luxembourg, same thing. Learn about the history, learn about what makes the country specific, and be aware of that, and explore that with people.
It's fascinating. Thank you. I know you've also done business in Latin America, although you haven't lived there. Can you tell us a bit about how that business climate acts?
Very different from Northern European or Northern American norms, and you have to be aware of the feelings, like how time is handled in a cultural context. In a social setting, if you're invited to a party and they're like, oh, 6 o'clock, nobody's there at 6 o'clock. If you arrive at 6 o'clock like a good German, you'll be the first one there. It's more like 7:15 and onward. However, business meetings, if they say 12 noon, it's 12 noon. It's a difference on how they handle punctuality in their and like in Europe versus America, in the US, you can jump into a business meeting. It's like, hey, good to see you. Let's get to it. So today we're talking about when to launch, branding colors, and PR protocol. What fonts are we going to use? In other countries, and that's the same for the UK, France, Germany, and Latin America. I've worked in Honduras, Costa Rica, Mexico, south of the border. Actually, Mexico geographically is still North America. However, it's a Latin country, as we know. You would first approach it with some personal, friendly conversation. You spend a few minutes getting to know each other, to get a bit of the temperature of the room, so to speak, learn about somebody. If you already met the person and some information was exchanged about, kids growing up, it's like kids went off to college, well, how they're doing. You have a few moments to chit chat before you launch into the business conversation. And it would be considered very blunt and abrupt if you just walk in like, so, okay, let's get right to business. That's not the way we do business.
This is a very American approach.
Yes. And in America, it's perfectly fine. It's like, don't waste anybody's time, especially in the larger cities.
Right.
Because nobody has time. So it's like boom, boom, boom. And in other countries, that's still considered a bit like, well, how about hello first? Like, how are you doing? And if you ask a German, how are you doing? You'll get the whole story.
That's funny. One of the cultural traits of Latin Americans and Latin American business, as well as in other parts of the world, the Middle East, Africa, especially in Asia as well, is personal introductions. That personal introductions are critical before you can really meet someone or do business with someone. And the introduction can be, oh, my mother went to school with your father, or we have a common classmate together, or my cousin has a friend who introduced us, something like that. Do you find that that's critical to do business in Latin America?
Yes, you need to work on a relationship. Since I was California based for the Honduras production back in the 90s, I started working with the consulate staff here in Los Angeles, and they referred and developed a relationship, and then they referred me to contacts within their systems in the country, in the universities and the Institute of Anthropology and History, for instance. Steve Elkins had contacts with Americans who were based in Honduras, who had their own network. One organizer, he was handling operations on the ground, like getting boats to travel up into the Mosquitia, transfers, equipment, etc. His wife's Honduran. She had family members who had gone to school with the then president. So that helped a lot. So it's through those contacts that you spend a lot more time preparing a story and getting to know people before you can actually put it together. So you have to have that extra time to build the infrastructure.
Build the relationships.
Yes.
Yes. And yeah, you mentioned the embassy, which is a wonderful
consulate. Embassy would be in DC, but we do have a general consulate here.
Yes. I was thinking for people who have no contacts in parts of the world where personal contacts are critical, one way to start is through either our embassy in that country or that country's consulates or embassy in our country, just to say, I'm going, I plan to go, and this is my project, can you introduce me? And usually the embassy people are extremely helpful and in making those kinds of introductions. And then also there's a wonderful group called the Global Chamber, which I happen to be a member of, and Doug Brunke, who's one of our interviewees on this podcast, he is the CEO of the Global Chamber. So that's another wonderful, wonderful source of introductions around the world. Mm. Another country that you've worked with is the Filipinos. You've worked with the country, of course, is the Philippines. You've worked with the Filipinos. I know you haven't worked in the Philippines, but since the Philippines was basically a colony of the United States for about 50 years, ending in 1946, are Filipino and American business styles similar, do you think?
In some ways, because since there was so much contact and such a merging of cultures in the Philippines for so long, Filipinos are very aware of how Americans do business. They're accustomed to that from day one. And the Filipinos who do well in business usually have attended American school in the Philippines. They're fluent in American English. They usually, the people I work with work in international business, very often for large American companies. Or work in import-export. Very many have family here or have spent several years living in the US, having gone to college in the US. So there's a lot more contact prior to business. So they're very accustomed to it. However, in their own culture, it's still more reverence towards older generation, a different understanding of how to treat superiors. It's more vertical in that sense internally. While all my guests have always been navigating the American business world and the very horizontal structures very well, internally it's more a vertical structure from who is in charge and how that trickles down. But I love working with Filipino groups because it's a wonderfully gracious culture, incredibly kind, gracious, and polite towards me as well as everybody else. It's just a very warm, welcoming, kind culture. And I find it very refreshing to see that they're still in this world. Everybody wants to be successful. Everybody works hard, but you can do that with kindness and politeness. You don't have to be blunt like some Germans or Americans.
Exactly. No, I found the same thing. The Filipinos are delightful people.
Yeah.
He's extremely polite and gracious, and always seemed to have no rush at all.
Yes.
Very
Yes.
relaxed.
But they get things done.
Yeah.
And it's always been the one. Every single time I get a job with a Filipino client, I'm like, yes, thank you. And because they do also, even if we're working very hard, if it's a convention or something, there's time for a little fun stuff on the side to just refresh. And there's more of an understanding of you need to counteract long hours with, even if it's a beach walk. I mean, there's those little things, or a nice relaxing dinner. It's not outside of the US, food is a much bigger issue for all cultures that I work with. And just like a 20-minute lunch break with a sandwich in the hallway doesn't do it. And Germans may adapt to that. And the UK may also be okay with it for a short time, going, well, that's how they do things here, but you don't do that with Filipino groups or with the French. If you're working with the French, you will have lunch.
Absolutely.
And you'll sit down for it. It's not a burger.
Exactly. Yeah, and Filipino food is outstanding. Cuisine is outstanding.
Yes. Yeah.
This is French also, of course. In terms of, you mentioned about the high, you're talking about vertically. And I think what you mean is a hierarchy.
Yes, a hierarchy where you have your CEO or company owner on top, and and then the different department heads, and then it fans out into the different sub divisions, etc. And that is in the US, it's much easier, and I love that about here, because if you have a great idea, you can cold call almost anybody. If that's of interest to that person, they will take your call and respond. In Europe and in the Philippines, that's much more difficult because you don't get past the receptionist.
Right.
And so you can't just waltz in with an email, a cold call, or in person.
Yes, and I assume it's very difficult to talk to the boss or to get to the boss in the Philippines for the same reason.
Yes.
Very interesting also. Since you've made these documentaries all over the world, and 50 documentaries at least, are there any subjects that are taboo, that are basically prohibited or should not be done in the different countries you've worked with?
For the Western markets, all the countries I've worked in that I've produced film for, some of them for the US, mostly Europe, there aren't any categories that are off limits, but there are differences in editing speed, in the visual language, as we call it, Bildsprache, how to film something, how fast the images are moving, how fast the different images are cut. So European television is a lot more beauty oriented. It's like BBC documentaries are a very good example of how it looks versus much faster hard cut American content. Editing for an American product is a lot faster, harder. And a European audience, our educational systems are different. So I went to school in France, England, and Germany. So I've had contact with those education systems. The approach is a lot more analytical and getting the bigger picture. Consequently, audiences want to see all angles of a story and want questions answered from all angles. Whereas in the US, you are urged to keep things more streamlined on one topic. You don't spread out that far. So it's there's a different approach and style, and in patience for how fast things move.
No, that's very interesting as well. In terms of the style, again, I'm not a film producer, but I've heard and I've read that when you're making a TV show or a movie in the United States, it's basically 5 seconds at one angle, and then the camera has to shift, and again 5 seconds and shift again. So it's constant movement, whereas I think in Europe it's much longer focused on the same position. Is that correct?
Yes, because the 5-second cuts make people nervous, and we even have a huge resurgence of what we call slow TV. One of my cameramen works for for Cineflight, a Germany-based international company that does real time filming of, for instance, river trips. He spent a whole week following one freight ship on the Elbe River from Dresden down to Hamburg and all the different stages. It's broadcast in real time. So you're just going along, you're watching the birds fly by and the animals along the shoreline scamper about, and little ripples in the water. It's extremely slow moving, and there's a huge demand for that. It started in Norway with slow TV, and European youth are fascinated by that. It's very soothing. And it's a huge trend and that has translated into the tourism world. The agencies I work with in Europe are now all about low carbon footprint, low impact travel, and slower. It's no longer all of the world in 8 days. It's, pick an experience and really immerse yourself in a culture, in an area, and explore the smells and the foods and the local culture, not just the viewpoints and back on the bus. So
it's an old movie. If it's Tuesday, this must be Belgium.
yeah.
Exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Back to the subject a bit of the taboo subjects. And you're talking about how the Europeans want to look at things from different points of view, which makes perfect sense. But the subject of World War II, for example, in the West, it's portrayed very much as total good versus total evil. And in Poland, there are laws now that you can't criticize the Polish people for aiding the Nazis, and for rounding up the Jews and aiding the Nazis. So if you would want to make a documentary in Poland about that, would that be prohibited?
I would have to check into Polish laws whether a foreign broadcaster, for instance, if I come in with a team, I wouldn't get sent to Poland. It's not my area. I don't speak Polish. But we have to ascertain, we have to get filming permits. We have to get, in many countries, visas to enter a country to work there. So I have to first of all find out what is the laws, what are the laws in each country, and if Poland has a law that makes it illegal to mention the collaboration, then would we be arrested for filming stories, interviewing people on that subject matter? Do we have to do it clandestinely? We can't be sued for broadcasting in a foreign country about the subject matter, but it could be possibly dangerous depending on what the laws are. And my team's safety is always the highest priority. I wouldn't, and there are private production companies that are very much guerrilla style, and they will take enormous personal risks and put their teams in harm's way, possibly. I don't work with those companies. I've had a few requests, and it evolved in the conversation that there was no budget for security. There was no budget for developing, for pre-production times, to develop a network to keep things secure. For a news organization, I did a lot of stories about crime, border crime, smuggling, and also gang wars in the United States. Those types of stories require building up relationships. so that you can enter that world safely. And if you don't have time and budget for that, there's no point in doing that. I'm not going to run into I had one request to film illegal drug dealing at night in gang controlled areas in Los Angeles for a French broadcaster. And I'm like, well, what's your preparation budget? What's your security budget? None. Just go in there, film clandestinely. I'm like, bye-bye. And it is a huge risk because you're observing something illegal and you're a witness to something they don't want you to witness. And as we all know, that can end deadly in the United States.
Well, and anywhere else in the world for that matter.
Yes.
Subjects.
Or you end up arrested, and I don't want to be arrested in a foreign country and end up in some horrible prison.
Right, exactly.
Or kidnapped. There's countries. One of my colleagues got kidnapped in the Philippines in a Islamist rebel controlled area.
South, probably.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking of doing a documentary, do you do research first to determine market research to determine the audience receptivity as you would do for a product? Or do you find funding first, or how does one go about determining the subjects that you're going to document?
Well, there's always trends in culture. There's zeitgeist we consider, and I have worked with the same companies for many years. We've known each other in many ways. Most of my co-workers, we've known each other for 20, 30 years, and we still work together. So it's a lot of back and forth and observing the mediascape. And Europeans at large have a huge interest in the environment and nature and conservation. And actually, the last 3 years, we just finished Thursday night, the 22nd of December was the first broadcast of a series of 5 films about Hawaiian nature and conservation.
Wow.
A big thank you to Film Hawaii for helping us, and a huge amount of protagonists and Native Hawaiians who worked with us. Hawaii has the highest. It was for a German company. It was produced by Spiegel TV. They had the idea and the request from Arte and ZDF. Arte is a pan-European culture channel, sort of like public television for France and Germany. And the content is supplied by French and German networks. So Antenne 2, TF1, ZDF, and ARD. This one was ZDF for Germany and Arte for France and Germany. And it's the first one broadcast this week, more to come in January. And the Europeans are fascinated because Hawaii has the highest rate of extinction. Kauai is like ground zero for extinction. Wow. And so it's a huge issue, and multiple organizations are trying to help flora and fauna survive, study why it's happening. And there's a lot of European universities involved in this. Through the University of Hawaii, there's international collaborations. So Europeans are actually quite aware, because a lot of European universities are on the ground, aiding financially, but also aiding with scientific exchanges. I had one French protagonist who's studying spinner dolphins, and I had an English protagonist. So there's a lot of back and forth.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I had no idea. Why was
so I don't film something just hoping that somebody down the line will be interested. I get requests from activists sometimes. And then if it's a message film, I lay it out on the table beforehand. Well, this is going to cost roughly X amount. And what kind of outlet do you have? You got to have a plan before you spend a lot of effort, time, and money filming something and contacting people, because you want to have an outlet. You want to have a plan in place. You got to know what story you want to tell and who you want to tell it to, so you know what to do. We storyboard. We don't just blindly go ahead and film away. Obviously, a documentary is not scripted per se, but we do have a storyline. We do a lot of research into, okay, these are what animals and what plants are affected, who's working on that, what subject matters are important for the overall theme of this film at this point in that area. And then I search the people that can speak to that. And we have a game plan. We're not just jumping around, hoping for the best. Everything's set. As much as can be. Obviously, then stuff happens. And then you have to have plan B and C because it never goes smoothly. However, there's a game plan, and it's the broadcasters have an idea of what they want to have, with the understanding that, you know, if we say, okay, and then the sailboat goes off into the sunset as if into a deep blue sky with some fluffy clouds, well, it's pouring rain that day that we have that plan. We'll have to come up with a different possibility. But because, you know, nature gets in the way, and the dolphins may not be where you want them to be the day you're filming. So you try to plan as best you can.
That is amazing.
So it's a back and forth. It's a conversation. Because of 2020, everything was, of course, put on hold. But we, my core team, which was 3-4 people for the most of the time, we kept communicating constantly with ideas, with research we found. And it's like, oh, I saw this. Like one of my German counterparts, one of the directors would call up and say, hey, I saw this. Can you check on this, whether this is still going on? Because sometimes stories on the internet don't have a date, and they could be 10 years ago. And then, you know, you're trying to follow up, and it's like, oh, that happened 10 years ago. The guy left the island. Well, we discuss back and forth, and it's a conversation. It's a relationship.
Since European television stations basically are all government, not all, but they're government run or government subsidized, unlike here, are they much more particular, I guess, about what they will accept, or they won't accept certain subjects, or they only want certain subjects that have a very broad audience, such as nature, for example?
Well, the networks won't allow product placement inside of a news department documentary. So reportage and documentary by law has to be informative and educational. We have to fact check. We can't just blubber nonsense. It's very strictly controlled. We do a lot of research. Once we filmed something, there's a lot of fact checking and background checking. We have to have consent from everybody, and we have to have permits for the locations. Subject matters aren't really off limits, but we can't have somebody holding a certain brand of a beverage if it's sold in our broadcast area. If it's not sold in the broadcast area, that's a different story. We're not allowed to pay for interviews. It's a huge no-no, because you don't want somebody telling you whatever, come up with nonsense just to make $1,000. So there's no interview fees. I talk people into participating and spending time working for free, basically, because it's a subject matter they want to share. They have an interest in telling their story. Or if it's linked to scientific research, very often those faculty, it's usually university departments or nonprofits, for their fundraising effort, having media coverage can be very beneficial. So it works for them because they will end up having a product that helps them raise funding. They, of course, are mentioned in the credits and in hashtag in social media messaging as well. So we collaborate on that level, but we're not allowed to pay. We can only reimburse real cost without any extras. But if they incur a cost like gas money for running us around on a boat, then of course we reimburse that. We don't want people spending their own money, but we have to have receipts for everything. There's also private channels in Europe, and they are less strict. They're more actually, they are more keen on broadcasting things that are definitely audience friendly, because they depend on viewership more than the networks. The networks aren't that concerned with it because the money is state funded. and advertising. So of course we want good ratings, but the RTL, Pro 7, and some of the M1 in France, they do have the concern of being very popular with audiences. They tend to be a little more racy. They may shy away from certain stories because it could affect advertisers. So a friend of mine, for instance, I helped along on the US side. It was an international look at the deadly side of Red Bull. Red Bull is the beverage. However,
Okay, say that again, please.
Red Bull, the
Oh,
energy
Red Bull.
drink.
Yes, yes.
Red Bull also supports a lot of extreme sports. And
Mm.
basically, the drink is sold because Red Bull is more of a media company. They have a huge amount of event production, international events, sporting events, a lot of documentary filming, a lot of Red Bull channel content with extreme athletes. And it was a look at the dark side of that industry, how they push athletes to perform stunts. They have to be ever faster, higher, more risky, more dangerous. And what kind of risk do people take to get the financial support? And there are athletes who have died. So a public broadcaster will take that on. A private shall not necessarily. If they get a lot of money from Red Bull advertising, they won't broadcast.
Right. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
So you have to know where, can you tell that story? And we solve those questions beforehand.
Right.
Yeah.
One of your other business interests, I guess, companies, is VIP tours. Can you tell us a bit of, as you've toured different foreign groups in the United States, are they coming for a specific purpose, like a specific industry, or for a specific conference, like agriculture, for example, or are they general mixed groups?
Large majority is business oriented. I got into that side stream of work, and actually now it's dual tracks because I had written a travel book for Germany, and then that led to my cameraman, who was also working with local American entities, was working with Los Angeles Tourism and Convention Board. That led to me producing video for international conventions, and then that led to me meeting all these agents and yada, yada, yada. Here I am working with the receptive tour operators and international agencies for business incentive and reward travel, as well as research travel. So that can be a European automobile maker inviting their top sales force to an elevated automobile-oriented visit in the United States. Or that could be just before the pandemic, I had started traveling with the agricultural research organizations, and there are agencies in Europe that specifically do these scientific research trips. We are not going to touristic sites. There may be one day at the beginning and at the end where they have a half hour, like a half day tour of a city. However, otherwise it's about irrigation, it's about fertilizers, it's about pesticides, how they're being handled in different areas. Since Europe has less predictable rain patterns, I had German vegetable growers visiting California and Arizona to check into irrigation because they hadn't had the problem in the past. So we were in Yuma, Arizona. We were in El Centro, California. We were in Bakersfield. I learned a lot about broccoli seed and organic baby carrots. It's fascinating because you learn an awful lot. And I have to prepare every single trip prior because obviously I didn't know anything about agriculture before. So the agency provided me with a lot of materials, and I did a lot of my own research, sort of like for a documentary film, to know what's going on, because then it turned out I had to translate a lot. And thankfully, some of the chemical words are very similar. And one participant knew, because that was for me, of course, again, could have been Chinese, just because I almost flunked chemistry in school. That's not my strong point. And so those trips are really fascinating because you learn a lot, or I learn a lot, and it's fun to help people, have a successful trip, go back with what they came for. And I've done also some leisure trips where they're more mixed up. However, that's not something, it's like basically when an agency says, we have an emergency, could you go on the road with a group? But then they're usually company trips that are rewards. And then it's more of a mix of generations and departments, because they're not specifically in the country for a business purpose. They're not meeting business contacts here. They're getting rewarded for outstanding performance in their own country. And then they get the trip of a lifetime sponsored by the company.
And do any cultural issues intervene if you're?
Yes, at times. I very recently was on a program. I'm not going to mention details because they could hear it. We were invited to a presentation here in LA. A very high-level international executive from an American communications company was doing a very interesting presentation, and a large group, it was about 80 participants, about 65 of them ignored the presentation and were on their phones. I was very embarrassed. I found it very rude.
Was this? Was this Americans doing that? Or?
No, that was Germans. And I found that very, very disrespectful.
Yeah.
And there's nothing I can do in that instant except for just go. And it was interesting to see that the boss, the one person who was in charge, was of course very polite and very engaged. So were his immediate staffers. It was the lesser level people who basically tuned everything out, which I found quite perturbing.
Were they young, like under 30?
Not all of them, but most of them were younger, yes.
Yeah, I can easily imagine young Americans doing the same thing.
Yes, and I've seen that also with once a year, I used to do a trip with French kids teaching English as second language to French students on the road with a language organization called Nacelle. And the driver on that trip has been doing that trip for, well, it stopped in 2020, but prior to that, he did that trip for 15 years. And he's an American guy who observed the change. We had these conversations about how the kids were changing. In the beginning, I did the first one in 2014 or 15. All the kids were laughing and singing and playing card games and engaging in conversations with me and the driver and their chaperone. And as time was going on, the last year, 2019, they were on their phones and headsets. They didn't even mingle amongst each other anymore. All these kids know each other because they're staying with host families in California for 2 or 3 weeks prior, go to a classroom setting to learn English and have local experiences, immersing in American daily life. And then there is a final 7 days, they go on the road with me. And so they know each other already, but they were just everybody in their own little corner. And then we got to Bryce Canyon, and there's this one viewpoint, inspiration point, where you see the whole amphitheater from a higher elevation, and it's an amazing, gorgeous view. And we are stopping, and I'm telling the kids, okay, we have about 15-minute hike to get to this amazing viewpoint, and it's one of the most beautiful, most fascinating views in the West. And it's a very clear day. In the further distance, you even see Navajo Mountain, a sacred site to the Navajo Indians. And this one kid goes, oh, I've seen that on Google Earth, I'm not going. I'm like, you're getting off the bus right now. Because the driver wants a break, and the driver has to have everybody off the bus and lock it before he can take a break legally. But I mean, it's sad to see how impoverished cultures have become and people have become because they're no longer looking around. And it was quite sad.
Well, it makes me a little bit more optimistic or happier to know that that Americans are not the only ones who do that.
No, it's everybody.
So it's the younger generation in the Western world, worldwide.
Yeah. And another problem that can occur is smoking. Europeans still smoke more. So do Filipinos, but Filipinos are very polite about where they smoke. And Europeans not necessarily. So sometimes like, no smoking here. Excuse me, you have to enforce some local rules, and which is also contradictory, because on one hand, Germans will chew you out for wasting too much water, or comment very strongly about how much electricity we use and how many old-fashioned cars we still have, and that there's no public transportation in the West and all of that stuff. and then the next thing they do is throw their cigarette butts into nature. So it's like, what? Didn't we just have this big conversation about nature and conservation and how much worse it is here than it is in Europe? And now you're just throwing your chemical junk right here into the canyon. So you're dealing with all sorts of adventures on the road.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
And I just encourage, I feel very privileged because I really enjoy my work and all the subject matters I can dip my nose into and my feet into and learn about, all the people I meet from all sorts of totally different walks of fame. It's a huge adventure, and it's always a privilege to go out on the road and to film or travel or do both together. And I'm very grateful for that. And I encourage everybody not to just get stuck on the computer and in their little phones. There's a world out there, and it's communication and experience of different cultures that enhances that communication, that will enrich your own life tremendously.
Absolutely.
And I hope we continue that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Marion. It's a wonderful pleasure to meet you, to get your superb insights, and to hear and have your great experiences.
Thank you so very much.
It
was wonderful to meet you. Thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation.